we're now on to our next job of trying to make this shape move across the screen. We've got it drawn just outside of our graphics window, and we'd like it to be gradually moving across here and going off the left-hand side. So how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to need something to keep happening, and we're going to need to move the location of this shape. Now, to do that, we're going to need what we know as a loop, and I'm going to be using a while loop to create a loop that never ever stops. So I'm going to say while 1 equals 1, and the reason I'm doing while 1 equals 1 is because 1 always equals 1, which means it will say, does 1 equal 1? Yes, so run the loop. Does 1 equal 1? Yes, so we run the loop, which means that this will never ever stop, which is exactly what I want to happen. Now in this loop, what I'd like to do is make my shape move. So to do that, I'm going to need to initially tell it where I'd like it to be drawn. Now, we saw before we can use this shape.move. We could actually copy and paste this. I'm going to rewrite it out. So shapes.move, and again, if we look at on the right hand side, it says we need the shape name and the x and y coordinate. So shapes.move, I'd like to place my shape into, well, which shape first? The top tube shape. And I'd like to draw it to, rather than a set location like we did here, I'd like to keep changing the location where I draw it. Well, how are we going to do that? Well, I think what we'll do is we'll come up with a new variable name for our shape, and I'm going to do this outside of the while loop. And the coordinates I'm going to set for this might be top tube. In fact, the tubes will have the same x location, so I'm going to say tube x, because the top tube and the bottom tube, when we come to create the top tube and bottom tube, will both have the same x coordinate. So I'm just going to set it as tube x, which is our tube's x coordinate, equals. Now, to start off with, just to initialize, to start off this variable, I'm going to set it exactly as we did in here to be the graphics window width. So it appears just off the screen. I'm also going to set its y position, but I don't think I need to do that just, no, let's do that. Tube, and of course the tube is going to have a top tube and a bottom tube. We're only playing around with this top tube at the moment, as it will become. So I'm just going to call this top tube, and we'll call it y. So it's the top tube's y position. And we're going to say that's equal to, as we did previously, 0 for now, and we can change that later on. Of course, this does make things a bit easier with this line of code. We could move this line of code now underneath where we set up those variables, and instead of telling it to go to the graphics window width, we could tell it to go to where tube x is. And instead of telling it to go to 0, because this might change later on, we're going to just move it to where the top tube y is, which we've already set to 0. Essentially, that hasn't changed anything. This program will do the same job with these extra variables put in. You're probably wondering, why have I needed to put them in just so far? Well, let's have a look at this. So every time I move, I want to redraw my tube in tube to location tube x and to location top tube y. Now, the reason we need to have these as variables is so that we can change their locations as time goes on. So what we could do is, in our while loop, we could say, well, once we've drawn the shape, let's say, well, what do we want to change, the x or the y coordinate? Well, we want to change it moving horizontally, so we're going to have to change the x coordinate. So I'm going to say tube x equals whatever tube x was, so tube x equals tube x, and I'm just going to change that to be minus 1. So what does that do? Well, it will say whatever tube x was, so it starts off as being the graphics window width, which is 800. So it starts off with 800, and then we take away 1 from it, so it will become 799, then it will become 798, 797 as we loop round. And of course, when we're moving that then, it's changing the location of that shape. So let's go and say tube x equals tube x minus 1, and we'll end that while loop. And of course, this while, when the program gets to this while loop, it will just keep doing this forever. So let's go and run that. Wow. that kind of flashed on screen and immediately flashed away. It's a little bit too fast for my liking. So I'm going to go and put a little program delay in here. So this is another useful command. I'm going to say program.delay. And how much would I like to delay? Well, as you can see over here, it tells us to put in brackets how much we want a delay to be in milliseconds. So maybe I could say every 100 milliseconds. I'd like you to delay. We'll try that. It might be too fast, it might be too slow, but let's just have a look. And if we go to run that program again, fantastic. We can start seeing the shape move. Now, if that's a little bit confusing about what's actually happening, I'm going to show you the faded instructions while that's moving. So it's just saying shape.move. We move the shape to wherever the X position is of the tube, so the tube X, and to the top tube Y. And because we're changing the value of tube X at all times, every time we go through the loop, it's changing where it draws it to a position slightly closer to 0. So it's just going to keep going through and doing that. If you wanted to see that in a slightly more progressive, we could do this in bigger steps, and we could do it slightly slower, and you can see it doing its jumps. Now, this is much like animation, where previously I was doing the steps in much smaller steps and doing it far more often, which makes it appear to be gliding as opposed to us redrawing it in lots of different locations. And this is the concept behind all games. They're all just basically animation, much like stock frame animation, if you're familiar with that. It's going to redraw the shape. The faster we do that, and in the smaller iterations, the more realistic it looks. So I'm going to set that back to being 1 and 100. And of course, if I wanted it to go faster, I'd need to delay for less time. So I could, for example, or speed up the movement it makes each time. So I could just say, well, let's delay, if we want it to go twice as fast, we'll delay for half the amount of time. Let's test that out, etc., etc.